Can you describe the writing process for The Healing Principles of Chiron, the first book about Chiron healing?
To write that first book was a really significant moment. I remember discussing with Trevor in that period of group meetings and development between 1984 all the way up to about 1988. A whole bunch of detail was coming through. Trevor was keeping detailed notes. Jan was developing and evolving as a channel as well. Kira had been coming through regularly, but we were getting other regular facets of Jan's channeling coming through, occasionally from Chiron as a master. Often John the Gardener was another that would come through. Each of them would have elements of healing that they would relate. As I was working with Trevor, I was an assistant in the clinic, and I always had that skill with writing, and I think the first idea came in about 1986. It was around the time that we established the first Chiron clinic, and Trevor knew then that he had a technique that he could apply, an almost entirely energy balancing technique. He still had good knowledge of his early chiropractic work, and there was a real integration going on. To this day, other healers use Chiron healing similarly. They'll work with some established physical technique that they know, but you can augment and add on to what you do with the energy techniques. And in many ways, as I described earlier, if you're balancing the etheric energy first with a Chiron healing method, then when you apply some other physical method from another technique, that's clearly going to work much better. It'll, in a way, act as a kind of the final switch that brings the now balanced etheric energy into physical reality as a balanced mechanism. So we were discussing this all along, and I think when Chiron Clinic was first set up in 1986, we began to realise that we should be, we're already writing lots of notes, and there's already a method there, but probably Trevor should teach this as well. And if you're going to teach, you're going to need a technical manual, and that was the original idea for the Healing Principles of Chiron. Trevor was in fact beginning to teach. Part of setting up the clinic was that he would bring groups of practitioners in. So in some ways it was an extension of the group healing, but Trevor decided to run weekend workshops. And so there was a regular series of weekend workshops that he got going and wanted to get going, and really needed to do that with some sort of a technical manual in place. So there was early dialogue between Trevor and Jan, and then it was my job to kind of compile the information that Trevor and Jan were identifying as the main elements of the technique, to compile it together. So I had a typewriter, believe it or not, an electronic typewriter behind the reception desk at Chiron Clinic, and I'd see patients in at reception and help take them into the room, etc. In between that, while the healing was going on, I'd be transcribing and writing things that Trevor had handed me, bits of paper he'd give me, or notes that I'd taken from discussion with him, bits of information that Jan had given too in response to questions that Trevor had. He'd asked for channeled confirmation or clarification around some of the methods he was using. So I began compiling it. So between 1986 right up to 1988, I was compiling all of this stuff, and finally we had a structure. And to write a book takes a while. It does take a year or two. The books I write to this day, 18 to 24 months on average to get them going. And the first Healing Principles of Chiron was sent to the printer and published in 1988. And that really sparked off the workshops that Trevor was then able to do. He could take this instructional manual in. I remember a series of workshops initially in Warrnambool, and we had quite a few people to this day who are registered Chiron healers who started coming on down to those workshops. Trevor also began running workshops down in the Melbourne area. There was he was practicing part-time in Melbourne because he received requests for that. So he worked with some kinesiologists down in Heidelberg initially, and then a little later down in Carlton over the years. And many of the people that came through his workshops, he was connected with at those centres in Melbourne too. But it was that initial publication of that book in 1988, The Healing Principles of Chiron, that really put the detail of the etheric pattern down on paper and gave the first structure to how to teach Chironic healing ideas, with a bit of a philosophical foundation as well, drawing particularly from Trevor's background, because it was really his impetus and his applied push to use energy healing in his practice that established the need for this to be taught further.
Was writing the further healing principles of Chiron much the same? And what about Chiron, Water and Stone, and other Chironic Enterprises books you were involved in writing?
Further knowledge was coming through, so it became apparent that Jan was channeling more, and we needed to write the further healing principles of Chiron. So I worked probably more closely with Jan on that book than I had the first one. Trevor was busy at that stage running his practice and teaching the work, and Jan was saying that she had this extra information coming. So the further healing principles of Chiron was even more technical than the first. We didn't have quite so much of the foundational philosophy in that book, but just an augmentation, in a sense, of the technique as it was being channeled by Jan. So it's a similar but different process. I was more regularly at that stage just going directly to Jan to say, well, what do you mean by this level or that level? And she'd clarify it. And it came together a bit quicker than the other book. It's not as thick, it's not as detailed. It was more of a compilation, series of tables. But it was significant in that it really articulated what are these healing principles of Chiron. The first book, we didn't really lay it out in a list form. By the time we got to the further healing principles of Chiron, it was clear, if we're calling these things principles, what exactly are these principles? And so that book is a significant one because it lays them all out quite specifically. In addition to giving just more minute detail around the energy patterns, the levels, it gave more information about things like a consequential line of energy and then some more advanced techniques for how to help ease pain and suffering in individuals. So the further healing principles was straight out channeled by Jan Trenorden. It was, as she was called at the time, Jan Thomas as she is now, and it was much more attributed to her. The first healing principles was much more of a collaboration between myself and Trevor, with Jan advising. The further healing principles was a more direct collaboration between myself and Jan in order to bring additional further information through for the technique. I worked with Jan on Chiron as well, and that was a fascinating time. Jan channeled Kira, giving us some quite specific and I guess basic sort of information about the energy levels and what Kira saw as being important for some people to know. So that was a similar experience as I described before, working with Jan. She would channel and provide, these chapters of information, and my job would be to run through the language, check the concepts, find words perhaps that could be contemporized and made meaningful for the particular readers that she was wanting to target with that book. So with Water and Stone, I regard that as my own kind of channeling of the future. I wrote some creative stories, and it's interesting, each of the stories I wrote in that book have kind of come true. It's taken a few years, but it was almost without knowing it, I'd kind of portended my own experience of life. I wrote a thing in there called The Healer Man, a little poem, a little poetic creative piece, which I ended up having to, or wanting to, read out at my father's funeral when he passed back to source. There's a story right at the beginning called The Pleasing of Mother, which is all about the environment and viruses that cause problems with health, and it feels like that was quite a forecast in some ways for where we are today with a pandemic. So that was interesting. There is another story in there too about technology and the demons that can come from it. How great technology is, but how there's a dark side to it, and I think that's kind of come true as well. I wrote Water and Stone in about 1991, and so all of those stories have persisted and come through. So that's my own little creative project, and that my own little foray, I suppose, into being a little bit clairvoyant about the future. But as a creative writing exercise, Water and Stone was quite rewarding, and there's a symbolism tied up into it as well. The work I currently do as an educator, I deal with two types of information in my education. One type is the scientific type, the type of information that is a snapshot of data. It's information that's captured and crystallized into a single piece of information. That's science. That's the scientific view. That's what I perceive as the stone in my Water and Stone book. The other type of information that I work with even to this day is relational information, the spaces between people. So when I teach organizational behavior, or when I discuss change management as a process, there's a whole bunch of relationships and relational knowledge that comes from stories and storytelling, from the emotional feelings that people have, emotional and social intelligence. That is the water in the Water and Stone that I wrote about all those years ago. I didn't really know it at the time, but as a creative writer, I felt that that was the best way of describing what I'd written, Water and Stone. Today, I now understand. Water is the fluid information, stone is the static information, and we need both of those. We need science, but not on its own. We need art and philosophy, but not on its own. The two have to come together, don't they? Water and stone have to coexist, and they do.